The penthouse on the 38th floor smelled like money and secrets, and Calvin Merritt had learned, over 17 years of driving other people's cars, that the two almost always came together. He pulled the black Lincoln into the underground garage of the Alderton Tower at 6:45 in the morning, the same time he had arrived every weekday for the past 4 months. He parked in spot B7, the one assigned to him by the building's parking attendant on his first day, and he sat for a moment before turning off the engine. The garage was cold and fluorescent lit and smelled faintly of exhaust and motor oil. Calvin found it more honest than the lobby upstairs, with its Italian marble and the orchids that someone replaced every Monday. He was 53 years old. He drove a 9-year-old Ford F-150 to work and wore the same 3 sport coats in rotation, navy, charcoal, and a dark green that his daughter Mia said made him look like a forest ranger. He did not mind. He had never been a man who needed to be looked at. The job was simple, at least on paper. Pick up Mr. Hargrove at 7:15. Drive him to whatever he needed, the office, meetings, the airport, appointments he never explained and Calvin never asked about. Return him home by evening. Wait if necessary. Say little, see less. That last part was the unspoken rule. Calvin had understood it without being told. Edmund Hargrove was 61 years old and one of the wealthiest men in the state of Connecticut. He had built Hargrove Capital from a 2-desk firm in New Haven into a company that managed assets for universities, pension funds, and a small number of private clients whose names appeared in newspapers for reasons that had nothing to do with their finances. He had been profiled in 3 national magazines. He had testified before a Senate committee on financial regulation. He owned a farmhouse in Vermont and a property in Montserrat that his personal assistant, a brisk woman named Beverly, referred to only as the island. He was also, from everything Calvin could observe, profoundly alone. Not unhappy, exactly. Not broken in any visible way, but alone the way a house is alone when it has been closed up for the winter. Structurally sound, everything in its right place, but with a quality of stillness that suggested no one had really lived in it for a long time. Calvin noticed things. It was a professional habit, sharpened over years of sitting in the front seat while other people conducted their lives in the back. He noticed that Mr. Hargrove always sat behind the driver's seat rather than in the center, even when traveling alone. He noticed that the man ordered the same lunch every Tuesday from the same Thai restaurant and ate it at his desk with the door closed. He noticed that when Beverly handed Mr. Hargrove his phone messages each morning, he sorted through them with an expression of mild, practiced patience, the way a person sorts through mail they already know contains nothing urgent. He noticed after the first 2 weeks that Mr. Hargrove sometimes coughed. It was not a dramatic cough, not the kind that stops a room. It was quiet and controlled, the kind a person produces when they are trying not to produce a cough at all. A short, suppressed clearing of the throat that Mr. Hargrove covered with his fist and that he always followed with a small, deliberate inhale as if testing the results. Calvin heard it in the car, he heard it in the parking garage when Mr. Hargrove walked the 15 feet from the elevator to the Lincoln. He heard it in the lobby of the Whitmore Medical Center on the 3rd Thursday of every month, where he waited on a bench near the window while Mr. Hargrove disappeared upstairs for an appointment that lasted exactly 40 minutes. Calvin did not ask about the cough. It was not his place. His place was behind the wheel, and he kept to it. His daughter Mia was 26 and lived in Bridgeport with her boyfriend and a tabby cat named Constellation, and she called Calvin every Sunday evening without fail. She was the kind of person who wanted to understand everything, why people made the choices they made, what they were really trying to say when they said something else, what it meant when someone was kind or cruel or both at once. She had studied psychology for 2 years before switching to nursing, and Calvin sometimes thought she had retained all the curiosity of the first career and added the practicality of the second. "How's the new job?" she asked him one Sunday in late November, a few weeks after he had started with Mr. Hargrove. "Fine," Calvin said. He was in his kitchen, reheating soup from the previous day. "Is he nice?" Calvin considered the question with the same care he gave most questions. "He's private," he said finally. Mia laughed. "That's not the same as nice." "No," he agreed. "But it's not the opposite either." Mr. Hargrove's daughter was named Serena. She lived in Philadelphia and worked for an architecture firm that did civic buildings, libraries, courthouses, a children's hospital whose rendering Calvin had once seen on the wall of Mr. Hargrove's office. She called her father on Tuesdays. Calvin could tell by the way Mr. Hargrove's voice changed, not warmer exactly, but less compressed, as if he allowed himself slightly more air when speaking to her. She had come to visit once, in October, and Calvin had picked her up from the train station. She was 33, dark-haired like her father, and she shook Calvin's hand and thanked him by name, which people in her family's position did not always bother to do. She did not visit again before December. In December, the cough changed. Calvin could not have explained precisely how he knew. It was the same sound, technically, the same suppressed, controlled clearance. But there was something different in the frequency, or in the effort required to contain it, or in the pause that followed it. Calvin had driven enough people over enough years to know that bodies communicated whether their owners wanted them to or not, and what Mr. Hargrove's body was communicating in December was different from what it had been communicating in October. He also noticed that Mr. Hargrove had started arriving at the car 3 minutes later each morning. Not later in the sense of being late, he was never late, not once in 4 months, but later in the sense of moving more slowly through the garage, the way a person moves when the air requires slightly more negotiation than it used to. Calvin drove. He said nothing. He watched. The 3rd week of December, he drove Mr. Hargrove to a new medical appointment, not the Whitmore Center, but a pulmonologist's office in Hartford that Calvin had to look up on the navigation system because he had never been there. Mr. Hargrove sat in the back with his coat on and his briefcase across his knees, even though the appointment was not near anything that required the briefcase. He did not look at his phone the whole drive out, which was unusual. He looked at the window instead. The appointment lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Calvin waited in the parking lot and ate the sandwich he had brought from home and read the news on his phone and did not let himself speculate. When Mr. Hargrove came back to the car, his face was arranged in the same expression it always wore, neutral considered, a face that gave away only what it intended to. But Calvin noticed that he placed his briefcase on the seat beside him instead of across his knees, and that he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked up. "Home, please, Calvin," he said. "Yes, sir." They drove the 40 minutes back to the Alderton Tower without speaking. The radio was off. The heater ran quietly. Outside, the Connecticut landscape was gray and cold and specific in the way winter landscapes are specific, stripped back to structure, nothing decorative left. Calvin pulled into the garage and came around to open the door. Mr. Hargrove stepped out and stood for a moment, as he sometimes did, in the cold air of the garage. Then he said, without looking at Calvin directly, "Do you know what emphysema is?" Calvin said, "Yes, sir." Mr. Hargrove nodded, as if this was not a surprise. "My father had it," he said. "I watched it for 8 years." He said it the way a person says something they have been holding in their mouth for a long time and have decided finally to set down. Then he walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with his back very straight until the doors opened. Calvin stood in the garage for a moment after the elevator closed. Then he got back in the Lincoln and sat. He thought about the cough. He thought about the way Mr. Hargrove looked at the parking garage floor when he walked to the car in the mornings. Not distracted, but conserving something. He thought about the briefcase on the wrong seat. He thought about 8 years and a father, and what it means to watch something you already know the ending of. He called Mia that evening. "Can I ask you something medical?" he said. "You can ask me something nursing adjacent," she said. "What is it?" He described what he had observed over 4 months, the cough, the pace, the new appointment, the word the man had used in the parking garage. He laid it out the way he would describe a route, methodically without commentary, every detail in the right order. Mia was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Dad, is he a smoker?" Calvin said, "He doesn't seem like one." What does seem like mean for someone like him? Calvin thought about it. Mr. Hargrove did not smell of smoke. His clothes did not carry it. His office, the few times Calvin had been inside, smelled of nothing in particular, paper perhaps, and the faint chemical undertone of an air purifier. His hands were clean. His teeth, when he smiled, which was rare, were the teeth of a man who had been to a dentist regularly and consistently for 61 years, but there was something Calvin had noticed and filed without knowing exactly where to file it. On the 3rd Friday of November, he had picked Mr. Hargrove up from a dinner at the Graduate Club in New Haven. A donor event for a university endowment. The kind of evening where people ate from small plates and spoke in lowered voices about large amounts of money. Mr. Hargrove had come out at 9:40, 20 minutes earlier than Calvin had expected, and instead of coming directly to the car, he had walked to the far end of the building's side alley, where there was a small awning and a concrete ledge, and apparently just enough shadow. Calvin had seen the brief orange flare before it was extinguished. He had said nothing. He had waited the appropriate number of minutes and then pulled around to the front entrance as if he had only just arrived. He had not been certain of what he had seen. He had not let himself be certain. Now, on the phone with Mia, he described it. She was quiet again. Then, if he's been hiding it, like actually going to serious lengths to hide it, then his doctors might not have the complete picture, depending on how honest he's been with them. He's had lung tests, Calvin said. He mentioned it. You can have tests and still not have the full conversation, she said. Especially if you control the environment around those tests. You don't smell like smoke. You don't look like a smoker. You're wealthy enough that people don't push you the same way they'd push someone else. She paused. People in his position get a certain kind of medical care that's very good at fixing the things the patient admits to, and very polite about the things they don't. Calvin sat with this for a long time after they hung up. He was not the kind of man who arrived at decisions quickly. He had learned, over a lifetime of working quietly in rooms where other people made choices, that the best decisions were the ones you came to slowly and stayed with once you'd arrived. The question was not whether he knew something. He knew something, or close enough to it. The question was what he did with it. He was a driver. He was a 53-year-old man who drove a 9-year-old truck and wore 3 sport coats in rotation, and whose most important relationship was a Sunday phone call with his daughter. He had worked for Mr. Hargrove for 4 months. He had no medical degree, no proof of anything, no standing in the man's life that would give anyone reason to take him seriously. He had only what he had observed, and the thing about observation, the thing Calvin had understood for a long time without ever putting it into words, was that it obligated you, not legally, not officially, but in the quiet interior way that mattered most. Once you had truly seen something, you could not genuinely pretend you hadn't. He drove to work the next morning and said nothing. He drove to work the morning after that and said nothing. On the third morning, a Thursday in mid-December, Mr. Hargrove coughed in the back of the car and then sat forward slightly and pressed 2 fingers against his sternum, briefly as if attesting for pressure. He did not think Calvin noticed. Calvin noticed. He pulled into the Alderton Tower garage. He parked in spot B7. He came around and opened the door as he always did, and as Mr. Hargrove stepped out, Calvin said, "Mr. Hargrove, can I say something that's none of my business?" Mr. Hargrove looked at him. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it sharpened, not with suspicion exactly, but with the attention of a man who had learned to assess people accurately and quickly and who was doing so now. "Go ahead," he said. Calvin held his cap in his hands. He had taken it off without thinking, the way men of his father's generation removed their hats when they were asking to be taken seriously. He did not rehearse what he said. He had decided the night before not to rehearse it, because rehearsed things come out shaped like arguments, and what he wanted to say was not an argument. He told Mr. Hargrove what he had seen over 4 months, not with alarm, not with accusation, and not with the particular kind of delicacy that is really just a more sophisticated form of condescension. He told him the way he would tell a person about a turn they had missed, calmly, specifically, without making them feel foolish for having missed it. The cough and how it had changed, the pace and how it had changed, the alley behind the graduate club, the briefcase on the wrong seat, the way Mr. Hargrove had stood in the garage after the Hartford appointment and said the word emphysema as if he had been waiting to say it to someone. Mr. Hargrove listened without interrupting. He did not look away and he did not look angry. He looked like a man who was hearing something true, which is a different expression from the one people wear when they are hearing something surprising. When Calvin finished, Mr. Hargrove said nothing for a moment. The garage hummed around them, the ventilation system, the distant sound of a car somewhere on a lower level. Then he said, "You're correct." He said it the way he said most things, without excess, without apology, but without defensiveness either, as if the accuracy of a statement was sufficient reason to confirm it. He had smoked since he was 29. He had quit for 6 years in his 40s. He had started again after his wife died, quietly, carefully, in the way that only careful men can be genuinely self-destructive. He had told no one. His doctors knew what his test showed and nothing more. He had believed, the way a person of a certain intelligence and a certain willfulness can genuinely believe, that he was managing it, that managing it and hiding it were the same thing. He looked at Calvin for a long moment. "How long have you known?" "I had an idea around 6 weeks in," Calvin said. "I wasn't sure until last month." Mr. Hargrove nodded. He put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the floor of the garage, the same floor he looked at every morning on the walk from the elevator to the car, and then he looked up. "My father died in the spring of 2003, he said. April 14th. He was 77. He'd had emphysema for 8 years, and he managed it with extraordinary difficulty and complained almost never. He said it quietly, without the performance of grief, just as a set of facts that had shaped everything else. I understand, structurally, that I am doing the same thing. I have understood it for a while," Calvin said. "Understanding something and doing something about it aren't the same thing." "No," Mr. Hargrove said. "They're not." He was quiet again. The car ticked behind them, cooling. "My daughter is coming for Christmas," he said. "Serena, she doesn't know." Calvin said nothing. "She's going to notice," Mr. Hargrove said. "She's like you in that way. She notices." He said it without resentment and without the irony that wealthy men sometimes use to acknowledge that the people paid to take care of them sometimes saw more than they intended. He said it as something he was willing to be told. He went upstairs and Calvin drove home, and that Sunday he told Mia what had happened. Mia was quiet on the other end for long enough that Calvin checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "What did he do after?" she asked. "He went to work," Calvin said. "He's always at his desk by 8:15. "And you?" "I drove." Another pause. "Do you think he'll do anything about it?" Calvin thought about the way Edmund Hargrove had stood in the parking garage, not with embarrassment and not with relief, but with the particular quality of stillness that settles over a person when they have stopped holding something they didn't realize was this heavy. "I think," Calvin said slowly, "that he needed to be seen first." He was right, though he would not know how right until later. Serena arrived on the 23rd of December. Calvin picked her up from Union Station, and she sat in the back with her bag and her coat folded across her lap, and she asked how he was and whether the holidays were treating him, and whether the traffic had been bad coming in. Small questions asked with genuine interest. That was a particular skill, and Calvin had noticed early that she had it. She had also noticed something in her father's apartment, or in her father himself, because when Calvin picked up Mr. Hargrove the morning of the 26th, Beverly had left a voicemail saying the 8 o'clock could be moved to 10, and when Mr. Hargrove came down to the garage, he came down with Serena beside him, and he said, "Do you have time to take us somewhere this morning, Calvin? We have an early appointment." The appointment was with a pulmonologist at Yale New Haven Hospital. A different one from Hartford, one Serena had found and scheduled, as it turned out, within 12 hours of arriving. Calvin drove them there and waited. He sat in the parking structure and read and ate the sandwich he'd brought, and did not speculate. He had gotten good at not speculating. It was, he had decided, the appropriate response to having done what he could. They were inside for 2 hours and 11 minutes. When they came back to the car, Serena's eyes were slightly red at the corners, in the way that comes from a difficult conversation rather than actual crying. Mr. Hargrove looked the same as he always looked, except that his shoulders were set differently. Not tense, but lower, not braced. Serena looked at Calvin in the rearview mirror as they pulled out of the structure. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "My father told me what you said to him, in the garage." Calvin said, "I hope it wasn't overstepping." She shook her head. "No," she said. "No, it wasn't that." She looked at her father, and something passed between them. Not a look of forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies an injury that had to be processed and named, and this was simpler than that. It was more like the look between two people who have agreed, without saying so, to face the same direction from here on. Mr. Hargrove said, "They want me to start a treatment program in January, pulmonary rehabilitation. It will take some restructuring of the schedule. I can work around whatever you need," Calvin said. "I know you can," Mr. Hargrove said. "That's why I'm telling you." They drove back through the gray December morning, through the Hartford traffic and the toll plazas and the flat industrial stretches that gave way, eventually, to the more composed geography of the shoreline. No one spoke much. The radio was off. The heater ran. At one point, somewhere near Madison, Serena said quietly, "He's been going to the same lobby in that building for 3 years, and no one who worked there ever noticed." Calvin did not say anything to this. It was not a question, and it did not require an answer. But he thought about it later, driving home in the dark. About the thing that happens when a person is surrounded by people whose job it is to manage rather than to see. About how wealth, in its thoroughness, can construct a particular kind of invisibility. Not the invisibility of being ignored, but the invisibility of being administered, of being kept and maintained and attended to in ways that leave no room for the simpler, less efficient act of being noticed. He thought about what Mia had said, that people in certain positions received a kind of medical care that was very good at addressing what they admitted to. He thought about how that was true of other kinds of care as well. How it was possible to be very well managed and very thoroughly unseen at the same time. He pulled into his own parking spot, not a garage, just a lot behind the brick building where he rented an apartment, and sat for a moment before going inside. His neighbor's car was there. The streetlight made a yellow circle on the wet asphalt. He called Mia. "He's starting treatment in January," he said. She exhaled. "How is he?" Calvin thought about Edmund Hargrove's shoulders in the back seat on the way back from New Haven. The way they had been set differently. Not fixed, not solved, but different. "He's going to do the work," Calvin said. "I can tell," Mia said. "How can you tell from the front seat?" Calvin smiled in the dark of his car. "Same way I can tell anything," he said. "You just have to be paying attention." He went inside and made dinner and read for a while, and turned off the light. And the city kept going outside his window, indifferent and various. And somewhere across it, in a penthouse on the 38th floor, a man who had kept his own secret for 12 years sat with his daughter under the same lamp where he had sat alone for many evenings before. And this time, finally, he did not try to hide anything at all.